2008 Tesla Roadster, and it's the other Tesla. Everybody knows the Model S, the 3, the X, the Y, but Tesla's roots go further back to this. This was Tesla's first real car, the ultra-rare Tesla Roadster, and today I'm going to review it. Before I get started, big news, this Tesla Roadster is currently listed for sale, being auctioned live on Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website. This Tesla Roadster has less than 15,000 miles, it's been in California its whole life, and it is a very rare early Roadster effort from Tesla. These do not come up very often, but you can get this one on Cars and Bids. So, after you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to check out the auction for this Tesla Roadster, where you can bid on it and buy it only on carsandbids.com. So let's talk Tesla Roadster. The Roadster was Tesla's first real effort to make it as a car company. This came out in 2008, and this is a first-year model with VIN number 162, one of the very first Tesla models ever built. Now, Tesla eventually built around 2,500 units of the Roadster before they switched production over to the Model S, which of course became the car that would launch Tesla into global success. But before that success, there was this, the Tesla Roadster, which is based on the Lotus Elise, but like other Tesla models, it is fully electric. It has about 250 horsepower, which is good for 0 to 60 in under 4 seconds. Pretty impressive, and the range back when it was new was around 250 miles, which was then and still is a pretty good figure. Back then, these had a sticker price of a little over $100,000 when they were new. And now it's time to take a look back at old school Tesla. First, I'm going to take you on a tour of this Tesla Roadster and show you all the quirks and features of the original Tesla, the one you don't hear about all that much. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug score. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the original Tesla Roadster by talking about getting in, and that means discussing the key. And yes, there is an actual metal key, an old school looking car key. This surprises me so much because after the Roadster, Tesla has led the industry revolution in getting rid of keys. To get into a Model 3, you use your cell phone, and you have as a backup key a card that looks like a hotel room key. It is so far from a traditional car metal key, but that's what the Roadster has. On the back it even says Tesla Motors, like they're proud of their key. But anyway, you turn it over, you have 3 separate buttons on this key. Lock and unlock, those are pretty self-explanatory, and a button that is simply marked Tesla. If you press the Tesla button, then the rear hatch in the car pops right open. Take another look at that, press the button, the hatch opens up. So, since it's open, let's go back there next. Alright, when you get into this back area, the first thing you notice back here is there's a storage area in back. A fairly sizable one, actually, goes the entire width of the car. You can put some stuff in here. You can see right now there's this black bag in the storage area. That contains the soft top for this car, which you can just install in case it starts raining. But you have a pretty sizable storage compartment back here, which is nice. But that's not the only thing under this rear cover. You also have a lot of the componentry that powers this car. You have battery stuff back here. Battery packs sharing this compartment with your luggage. And you can see them here, and you can also hear them. The car is off right now, but take a listen to the sound this battery stuff is making.
Still fresh.
You can kind of hear sort of a pump and then like a liquid sound, almost like trickling water. I suspect that is to keep the battery cool. I've just driven the car. It's fairly hot today, and so it's cooling down the battery, and that sound continues. Even though I've turned the car off many minutes ago, trying to keep the battery cool. An interesting thing, you don't hear that on modern electric cars, but like I said, this was sort of a beta testing first effort. Other interesting quirks back here, there's this little tape on the battery component, and it says, warranty void if seal broken. I guess they don't want you to get in there and tamper with stuff, and so that seal is intended to make sure you won't, because if you do that, you'll void your warranty. Also back here, another interesting item, there's this yellow cover, and it says on it, emergency SRS disabled. So you flip this up, and I guess there's an emergency switch here to disable your airbags, which I've never really seen before. I'm not sure if other cars have that. Not exactly sure why you would want to do it, but you can disable your airbags in the back of a Tesla Roadster, one of many strange controls in this car. Next up, another interesting item under here. If you look on the underside of the trunk lid, you can see a little bottle over to the side, sort of tucked into a little holder. That is a can of Fix-A-Flat. This car doesn't have enough space like underneath it or in the storage compartment for a spare tire, so instead they give you a Fix-A-Flat and tell you good luck. Actually, this isn't unique to the Tesla Roadster. A lot of sports cars that don't have room for a spare tire do the same thing. But anyway, since I'm talking storage, I wanted to discuss the front compartment in the Tesla Roadster as well. Now, to access this front compartment, you go to the left of the steering wheel. There's a little lever that you pull. You pull that and it unlatches the front compartment to this point. And from there, you just kind of lift it up and open it. It's very light, very easy to lift up. And once you get under here, you discover there's no storage in this front compartment. In fact, there's a warning label under here that specifically says, do not use this area for storage, for putting anything in here, because that's not what it's designed for. Your exterior luggage compartment in this car is purely the one I showed you in back. Nothing up front for that. Instead, up here, you can see you have some fans, some mechanical components. You can add some fluid up here, but no room for any storage in the front of the Tesla Roadster. Instead, this is what it looks like. Now, of course, when you are done doing whatever you need to do in the front, you pretty much just slam this back down, and then you're good to go. And next up, we move on to getting into the Tesla Roadster, which has a very, very interesting quirk worth covering. Now, the door handles in the Roadster are not mechanical. Instead, there's an electronic release. You walk up, you touch this little rubber button on the door, and then it pops open electronically. You can hear the release, different from the mechanical door handles in most every car. But if the battery is dead, then how do you get into your car? Because the electronic door handles won't work. Well, Tesla has thought of that. There is a hidden mechanical release on a keyhole underneath the door. You go under the door and you can see this little keyhole hidden here, and this is how you can get in. You stick the key into this keyhole, you twist it, and the door opens mechanically instead of using the little release. A lot of people don't know this. A lot of Tesla Roadster owners don't know this, but there is a second way into this car's doors in case the electronic release has failed or the battery is dead or whatever. A hidden keyhole under the door. That's a pretty neat quirk. But anyway, now I'm inside the Tesla Roadster. Before I go any further, though, I want to go back to the Lotus connection. I mentioned earlier this car was based on the Lotus Elise, and in fact, it was heavily based on the Elise. Lotus would even go so far as to build the chassis of this car for Tesla in the UK, and then ship the chassis to California, where Tesla finished all the rest of the assembly. And there was a lot of stuff shared with the Lotus Elise in this car. One of those things is the setup of the front and rear compartments. The Lotus Elise also had the rear compartment with an engine and a trunk, and the front compartment with no storage, and that's obviously carried over to the Tesla Roadster. But when you get in this car, there is a lot more Lotus stuff in here. For instance, the turn signal stock, straight out of the Lotus Elise. Same deal with the windshield wiper stock, also straight from the Lotus Elise. The parking brake is straight from the Lotus Elise. So is the whole dashboard design, panels, materials. All that stuff comes out of the Lotus Elise, including the speedometer binnacle area. These seats are also straight out of a Lotus Elise. They just shared the Lotus seats, of course, because they fit in here. They were already designed for this car, so they put them in. The windshield is shared with the Lotus Elise. The body panels were all different, but the windshield was the exact same part, I guess because it fit in this space, fit around the dashboard, and it made sense to use that. If you had an Elise, and I did, a lot of this stuff will seem very familiar to you. Probably my favorite Elise shared component, though, is the steering wheel, straight out of the Lotus Elise with no modifications, except there was a problem. Lotus's logo is circular in the center of the steering wheel, and Tesla's isn't. So they adapted. You can see the Tesla logo has been placed on a circle in the center of this steering wheel in order to fit the space that the Lotus logo had previously occupied. It's just funny to see all of that Lotus stuff in here and some of the adaptations they had to make. But anyway, aside from all the Lotus components in here, let's talk through some of the other interesting quirks and features of the Tesla Roadster, starting with starting it, which is very unusual. You stick the key in a little ignition and then turn it, just like you would on a gas car. Again, this is crazy to imagine now because you get in a modern Tesla and you just basically sit down, put it in drive, and go. There's almost no key interaction at all. But back in the day, they probably thought that would confuse people, so they wanted to make it like a gas-powered car. So you stick the key in, you turn it, and then it's on, even though there's no engine to turn on, and then you can shift it into gear. And let's talk about shifting it into gear. The gear lever is absolutely bizarre. You can see it has like 3 little parts where it can go. R, N, and D, obviously for reverse, neutral, and drive. And you move it very easily to those little pieces once the car is on, and it sort of feels like a joystick you would move at an arcade, like a lever in an arcade game. That's the gear lever for the Tesla Roadster. Now, going through some other interesting controls in this center console area. For one thing, you have a button marked TC, and I assume you press that and turn off the traction control. This is, after all, a sports car. If you wanted to get the tail out, you could turn off traction control and slide it around. You also have some other buttons and controls in here, mostly for the climate controls. You can see all of your usual climate control buttons, nothing particularly unusual or special in here. Air conditioning, change the fan speed, the direction of the air. You even have heated seat controls at the very top of all these controls. These little buttons will turn on or off your heated seat. A nice luxury, but then keep in mind, this car cost over $100,000 back in '08, so heated seats were fairly expected at that price point. But anyway, next up, let's go back to turning the car on. You turn the key in the ignition switch, and then the car makes some odd noises. There's some unusual warning chimes in here. My very favorite strange warning noise it makes is the door lock. So you press the door lock button once and you get this beep. You press the door lock button again and you get 2 beeps. Now, you don't hear the doors locking and unlocking because it's all electronic, the door mechanisms, like I showed you earlier, but it is a little confusing because which is lock and which is unlock? 1 beep or 2 beeps? Lock or unlock? I don't know. I still don't know. It doesn't really make any sense, and it doesn't show you anywhere else that it's locked or unlocked. You just hear the beeps, and you have to know the code of the Tesla door lock beeping. But anyway, some other interesting things happen when you start the car. For one, let's go into the gauge cluster, where on the left you have a tachometer, which is odd because this is an electric car. It shows RPMs, but there are no RPMs. There's no engine to turn. It's strange to see a tach in an electric car, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is pretty much the only electric car that ever had one. Now, the reason for the tachometer is that the original Tesla Roadster was going to be made with a 2-speed transmission, and so a tachometer was going to be necessary. But in the end, I think all of these got a single-speed transmission. Maybe some early ones were built with a 2-speed, but it was replaced later with the 1-speed, and so the tachometer is pretty much useless, and I guess it really just shows kind of the power you're using of the battery as you drive along. You can see there's a 13 red line, and it goes up to 15, but 15 what? It really doesn't make a lot of sense. To the right of that, you have a speedometer, of course, which is self-explanatory. There's also a little screen in the corner of this gauge cluster area that shows, most importantly, your battery level. You can see a little battery, and it's mostly charged up, and that lets you know how much battery you have left. But in this car, by far the most interesting controls are over to the left of the steering wheel on the dashboard below the climate vent. Next to the door, you have this screen here. You can see this is a touch screen that is intended only for the driver's use. Because in the center of this whole dashboard, you have your stereo, and obviously you use that to control music, whatever, but the touch screen to the left of the steering wheel controls all of your car functions, and I'll take you through its interesting quirks. Now, in its default screen, you can see there's like a top-down view of the car, and also the time. That's a clock showing you the current time. The top-down view will change. If you open up a door, it will show you that the door is open by showing, which door on that top-down screen has been opened up, so that makes sense. But there are also a few little buttons you can press around this touchscreen to go into various different menus. In the upper right, you see like a tuxedo-looking thing. That enters valet mode, which I imagine restricts the speed of the car. You put in a pin, and then it's in valet mode. In the bottom right, you can see there's a little lock button, and that also lets you put in a pin to lock out, I guess, this screen, and then people can't, I guess, adjust stuff or change your settings or whatever, so it's like a little security measure. And by the way, also on this default screen, you will notice that it gives a range estimate. In addition to showing like your approximate battery life with a graphic, like in the gauge cluster screen, it also tells you actually how many miles it thinks you have left based on your current driving style. But the most interesting things in this screen are in the two little button areas on the left. We'll start with the bottom left where you have a wrench. You can use that to adjust vehicle settings, and there are some unusual ones. For one thing, you can adjust the Tesla button on the key. Remember earlier I showed you press Tesla and it pops open the little rear hatch in your storage? Well, it doesn't have to do that. It's programmable. You can program it to arm the alarm, for instance, if that's what you want, or somehow use the HomeLink system to open a garage door, or whatever. Different configurable items on that key fob button. Never seen that before. That is a pretty cool idea. Also in this little wrench settings menu, you can adjust your charging mode. So it tells you, do you want to charge very quickly, which will deplete your battery life faster, or do you want to charge slower, which obviously will take longer, but then your battery life will be preserved more. You can choose that in this little touchscreen, and it tells you sort of which is which depending on your preferences. Now also in this little settings menu, some less interesting stuff, your usual car settings, like you can change the clock in here, or you can change the units, like if you want the odometer display in miles or kilometers, that sort of thing. Nothing particularly unusual in the rest of the settings menu. But there's one more interesting menu in here. To the upper left of this screen, there's a button with an eye on it for information, and there is some very interesting information displayed in here. For one thing, you click vehicle info and it gives you like a side profile of the car and your VIN number, but it also tells you your build date and of course where it was built. Tesla very proud of making these in California. That is a pretty cool little touch. A more interesting item in this info menu is the fuel saved section. You tap on that and it tells you exactly how many gallons of fuel have been saved throughout the life of this car. Your odometer reading, here's how many gallons you've saved and how many barrels of oil you've saved during the driving of this car, which is a pretty neat touch. Also, that was a big reason why people bought these, to save fuel, to save the environment, and it actually gave you an update on how much environment you were saving. You also have a little space in here that says energy history, which tells you how much energy you have used while charging the car in its lifetime and how much energy you have regenerated by braking, by slowing down. There's regenerative energy capturing in this car, of course, and it tells you how much you've regened, and that also is a pretty cool little thing to see. And one more interesting item in here, your charge history, which actually shows you all the last times you've charged, how long your charge was, and how much energy each charge used. You can see that right in this little screen in case you're wondering, how long you had it plugged in, how much charge you put into it, how much energy, that kind of stuff. It's all displayed in here. Now this stuff is all really cool, but let's be honest, it is a far cry from Tesla screens that came later. This tiny little screen that is only accessible to the driver. The passenger can't touch or see any of it. And it's just in the corner, very small, a far cry from the Model S with its massive screen that was coming in only a few years. But this is, like I said, sort of the beta testing beginnings of Tesla, and that screen was the beginnings of one of the things that Tesla would become so known for, its in-car screen technology. Interesting to see where it started. But anyway, beyond the tech, some other interesting things in this interior. For one, you don't have a glove box in here. The Lotus Elise didn't have one also, and this car doesn't either. You do have like a storage tray underneath the dashboard where you can keep stuff if you want, but obviously not particularly useful if you want to keep stuff hidden or out of view. Now, next up, under the dashboard, you had an iPod connection down here in this little cubby beneath the climate controls, which of course was nice to have, and you also had your cigarette lighter outlet down here, so you could plug something into that and charge devices in the car. So those features were in here, just sort of hidden and out of the way. Now on the door panel, you had power windows in this car, although these switches are not the ones they used in the Lotus Elise. And I'm trying to figure out what car they were used in, and I just can't quite place it. Maybe a Ford? It'll hit me on the drive home, I'm sure of it. But these window switches were obviously borrowed from something else, but they did have power windows. Another control in here, relatively simple, is below that screen to the left of the steering wheel. You have your headlight control. If you just flip this switch, turn on the headlights, again, probably borrowed from something else, and definitely pretty simple, easy to turn on. Now next to the headlights, you have a little button with a car and a trunk. You press that and it pops open the rear trunk. That storage compartment I showed you before, you can open it on the key or you can open it by pressing that button and it'll pop it right open. Another notable item in this interior is the orange accents. This car is finished in a color called Very Orange, and they carried that color into the interior. You have orange accents on the seats and on the door panels just to remind you of how orange your car is. And by the way, speaking of the seats, check out on the side of the seat you have this little pump. That is to adjust your lumbar support in the seat. A lot of cars, there's a little switch, you press it, your lumbar support automatically, electronically adjusts. Not in the Tesla Roadster. You had to pump it, squeeze this pump a bunch of times, and that would adjust your lumbar support, which is kind of an old school way to do it. Crazy to imagine a $100,000 car with a pump for lumbar support, but hey, at least it had adjustable lumbar. And next up, we move back outside the Tesla Roadster to go over some other exterior quirks and features. But first, I want to talk styling, and specifically Lotus Elise connection. Out here, you can see a similarity to the Lotus Elise for sure, but this definitely isn't a Lotus. Tesla redesigned the car, restyled it, kind of made it its own design. You see one sort of at a glance, you think, is that a Lotus? But when you look closer, you can tell that it definitely has a distinctive look to it, separate from what the Lotus Elise had. But you can see the Lotus influence in this car, since it had the same chassis, the same hard points, they had to all fit, and so there are some similarities, but not identical. Now, some interesting quirks on this car. On the outside, one is the taillights. You can see a few different circles, and they're all clear. When they're off, they're just sort of clear lights until they have to light up. And you can see, like, the turn signal's red, the brake light's red, whatever. But when you have them off, they go back to being clear, which is kind of a cool look, or at least it was in vogue back in 2008 when this car was new. Also back here, you can see Tesla written across the rear. Although the A is partially missing, kind of a sad thing, but it does say Tesla to let people know exactly what this is. Probably a pretty confusing thing to see on the road back in 2008. Now, the other interesting item on the outside of this car is the fuel door. You can see just behind the driver's seat on the outside, there's your fuel door. I think that's the same place it was in the Lotus, but obviously this car doesn't take fuel, so you open that up and it's the charge port door. That's where you stick the charge port in to charge the car. Now, most later electric cars moved the charge port to the front, mainly so people could pull into their garage and then easily hook up a charger mounted on the wall to the front of their car. But in this one, either Tesla hadn't thought of that, or that location just made the most sense, since it's where the Lotus's fuel door was, so they went with it. One other interesting quirk in the rear area, you can see a keyhole back here. This is like an auxiliary keyhole for the rear compartment. Same deal with the doors. In case the electronic popper mechanism fails, the battery dies, you stick your key in here, you turn it, and then you can get into your rear compartment, even if your battery is dead. This one, though, not integrated like under the car in quite as weird of a way as the emergency keyhole on the doors. And so, those are the quirks and features of the original Tesla Roadster. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the Tesla Roadster, the original Tesla Roadster. Now, if you've been watching my channel for a long time, you probably know I have actually already reviewed one of these. It was, I guess, about 5 years ago now. I reviewed one from a private owner who was in Syracuse, New York. He's a really nice guy, and he was one of the very first people to reach out to me and offer me to review his privately owned car. Back then, I hadn't done any supercars or hypercars. It was kind of a risk on his part to trust me. But that was one of my first car reviews 5 years ago, and it was a really cool experience. And so I drove one once before then, but my channel has changed so much. I now get so much more in-depth that I really wanted to review another one. Plus, this one is on Cars and Bids, and it's bright orange, and it's local. It just seemed like a great opportunity. So let's talk driving experience. This is a very interesting car. I actually owned a orange 2006 Lotus Elise, and this is an orange 2008 Tesla Roadster. There are a lot of similarities. One of the similarities is the steering. This car has the Lotus's non-power steering, very direct steering feel. And that means that it just darts around. And I suspect one of the reasons that Tesla wanted to use Lotus as a basis for their car is Lotus had already established themselves as a pretty good manufacturer, well-respected manufacturer of sports cars. And this is a pretty good sports car. The Elise was, and as a result, the Roadster is too. And a lot of the weight in the Tesla Roadster is in the same place as the weight was in the Lotus Elise, so in the middle, directly behind the seats. And as a result, you can kind of fling it around like a Lotus Elise. You get some of the same feedback, you get some of the same cornering and handling abilities, and this car always drove pretty well. And, frankly, it's pretty quick. For it. Whoa! Whoa! This car is fast. They said 0 to 60 in like 3.9 seconds, which doesn't sound that fast considering the price point at the time was like $110,000. But this was a different era. 2008, the Bugatti Veyron was the only hypercar. It wasn't common for vehicles to do 0 to 60 in the 3 to 3.5 second range. And this was pretty impressive at the time for being able to deliver that. Obviously now, not quite as impressive, although values have come down, and it feels to me to be still a pretty thrilling experience. And the other big benefit in terms of the thrill is you're very low to the ground, the road is right there, and so it feels, whoa, it feels a lot faster than it probably is, to be frank. Now, with that lowness to the ground, I gotta tell you, it is low in this car. I'm directly next to a giant truck, and I feel little. That was always how I felt in the Lotus Elise, too. Just little and kind of scared at any given moment that you might be killed. But the best sports cars tend to be small and, lithe. You can throw them around. That was Lotus's philosophy. Instead of adding more power and complexity, just take everything out. And this car, obviously, is part Lotus. It is very interesting now to drive this car and see not only an early Tesla, but an early electric car. I remember when this came out, the reputation of Tesla was kind of a joke. It was like a lot of other EV startups. It was like, okay, they're using a Lotus and they're charging that much money. It was just kind of stupid. And it wasn't until the Model S came out and validated Tesla as a brand that this car sort of started to seem, oh, that was an interesting beginning for this company that was really legit. Everybody knew, even back then, that these cars drove pretty well. But it just $110,000, $120,000 for this startup brand, you never knew what was going to happen. But in the end, I actually now think these cars are severely undervalued because it was like this low production run, 2,500 units of a brand that later became an icon. And I'm really surprised, and I suspect one day we'll see these on Concours d'Elegance, lawns as like, oh wow, an original Tesla. This brand that has become so popular and so successful. And so that's the original Tesla Roadster. What an unusual vehicle. From a technology standpoint, this is way behind other Tesla models. It almost seems like a beta testing early effort, which frankly, it kind of was. But it helped pave the way for Tesla's future success. And for that reason, I think it's pretty cool. That and the performance, which is actually pretty thrilling. Anyway, now it's time to give the Tesla Roadster a Doug score. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, this looks cool. Not amazingly beautiful, but cool enough, and head turning, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Acceleration does 0 to 60 in 3.9 seconds, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Handling is pretty sharp, although it can feel a bit light up front. Still, it's quick to turn, responsive, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Fun factor is surprisingly high. This is quick. It feels really quick, and it turns sharply. It's a real thrill to drive, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Finally, cool factor, and this is cool. The general public doesn't really know what's cool, which bumps it down a bit, but if you know, you know, and people who know find it very cool, and it gets a 7 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 35 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. It has some stuff, like power windows, a power trunk opener, keyless entry. It's not totally featureless, but it's also pretty low on good features and tech, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Comfort is not great. Getting in and out is a challenge, and ride quality is harsh, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Quality is average, build quality is acceptable, maybe better than newer Tesla models, honestly, but materials aren't very nice inside. Reliability, I know early cars had some issues, but I haven't heard of any real problems in years. Still, it gets a 5 out of 10. Practicality is low, normal for a car like this, and it gets a 2 out of 10. Finally, value, and frankly, I think these are great values. The car that started Tesla, I can't believe these aren't more valuable, and I suspect they will be someday, and it gets an 8 out of 10 for a total daily score of 21 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 56 out of 100, which places it here against, well, truthfully, I have no idea what to compare it to. Here it is against some other Tesla models and some other sports cars from its era, but really the Tesla Roadster stands alone. There's not much like it. And frankly, I think it's a very cool and special car, especially given Tesla's success in the years since the Roadster appeared.